In this news roundup for the week on 9th of December 2022, releases of internal documents confirm Twitter does shadow ban people, sometimes even when they haven't broken the rules. China finally calls time on zero COVID, and now the world watches to see if it can avoid the fate of Hong Kong. The UK U-turns on wind turbines and approves a coal mine, thereby ensuring that nobody's happy. And in this week's Short Thought, how if a story outrages you, that's exactly when you should double check to make sure it's true. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. This week saw Elon Musk give access to Twitter's various documents to journalists Matt Taibbi and Barry Weiss, with the result that some of the curtains are being drawn back on the platform's political bias. The second reveal showed that, in spite of the fact that it had been explicitly denied in the past, Twitter does indeed shadow ban people. And this shadow banning has indeed extended to certain figures on the political right, even when they haven't broken any rules. So we now have screenshots showing the Twitter employees' view of how accounts were tagged. So here's Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who was one of the voices arguing against the policy of COVID lockdowns. He was given a trends blacklist tag, which meant that nothing he tweeted could ever end up trending, hence getting more attention. Republican talk show host Dan Bongino, his account was placed on a search blacklist, presumably meaning his tweets wouldn't appear when people were searching on the topics that he was discussing. Conservative activist Charlie Kirk was put into a do not amplify list. Barry Weiss reported a conversation with one Twitter engineer who said, "We control visibility quite a bit, and we control the amplification of your content quite a bit, and normal people do not know how much we do." Ah, normal people, those guys. Thank goodness we don't employ any of those. In 2018, Twitter's then head of legal policy and trust, Vijaya Gad, and the then head of product, Kayvon Baker, said, "We do not shadow ban, and we certainly don't shadow ban based on political viewpoints or ideology." Which is kind of a fun statement, because if the first part is true, the second part is wholly redundant. But the first part was not true. So what about the second? After all, you might have noticed that 2 out of the 3 screenshots also had recent abuse strike tags. So you could argue that this is simply a system for keeping recent rule breakers out of the fast lane and therefore being amplified. And that isn't necessarily even a bad thing to do if the criteria for when it happens are published and followed and the application of the status is disclosed with the possibility of appeal, none of which was the case, of course. There was a group called the Strategic Response Team that took decisions on whether to limit the reach of certain users. They apparently handled around 200 cases per day. But then more sensitive cases could be reserved for the top-level group, Site Integrity Policy Escalation Support, known by the catchy acronym SIPPS. This was the top executives and the one to judge on politically sensitive cases. High follower accounts, well-known controversial accounts, this is where they would be dealt with. One such account is Libs of TikTok, the account that's become a viral sensation with 1.4 million followers, basically by finding liberals saying and doing crazy things on TikTok and giving them the gift of wider exposure on Twitter. This account was in the Trends blacklist and had been given numerous 7-day suspensions, 6 in 2022, but for breaking which rules exactly? The account owner, Chaya Raichik, was informed the suspensions were for breaking the rules on, quote, hateful conduct. What constituted the hateful conduct was never really clear. That lack of transparency for which social media companies generally have now become infamous. Barry Weiss reported that in an internal SIPPS memo in October this year, the committee acknowledged that the account has not directly engaged in behaviour violative of the hateful conduct policy. So, 6 suspensions for breaking a rule that Twitter executives acknowledged privately but not publicly had not been broken. Let that sink in for a moment. The committee justified the suspensions anyway by suggesting that her posts encouraged online harassment of medical providers by insinuating that gender-affirming healthcare, that practice so non-controversial that the UK National Health Service has now shut down the clinic that practiced it, is equivalent to child abuse or grooming. Now, obviously, if the account had ever called for people to engage in harassment, that could have legitimately have been hit with action. But if drawing attention to some people doing a thing, something that they've made public themselves in a different forum, if that in itself is to be taken as incitement, you have to conclude a rather active political filter is being applied. And so it seemed on the evidence. Rachik was eventually doxed by another user, with her physical home address published on Twitter. When she complained to Twitter support, she was told that it didn't break any rules, and it stayed up, to this day, in fact. This second set of revelations followed the initial tranche that was revealed by Matt Taibbi. That showed how the internal conversations had gone over the Twitter's suppression of the New York Post story about the Hunter Biden laptop. That, of course, was in the run-up to the 2020 election, and the internal discussion showed a significant amount of internal debate between those who took the initial decision and those who couldn't help but notice that there wasn't really any solid policy justification for doing it. Twitter suspended the New York Post account. It suspended the then White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany for linking to the article and basically organised to keep it off the site as much as possible. This was an extraordinary intervention by a platform in the process of information dissemination during an election. They did so with the excuse that they thought the information might have been the result of hacking. But that was always obviously a lame fig leaf. As one Twitter employee told Taibbi, they just freelanced it. Hacking was the excuse, but within a few hours, pretty much everyone realised that wasn't going to hold. But no one had the guts to reverse it. Yoel Roth said in one internal document, "Given the severe risks here and lessons of 2016, we're erring on the side of including a warning and preventing this content from being amplified." Various people have speculated, as you might imagine, as to what they believe the lessons of 2016 might have been. In that election, late-breaking news about the FBI's investigation of Hillary Clinton's email server was seen to damage her campaign when it most mattered. And there's no doubt this story was intended by the Trump campaign to do similar damage with the similar timings. But you know, if it's true and it's newsworthy, is it Twitter's job to intervene just because of the politics of its employees? There were some saying that because the truth behind the claim wasn't certain, then they had to intervene. I would suggest you can make the argument more powerfully in the opposite direction. When the truth behind the claim is not known, you should not interfere. You have no basis for interference. One of the most interesting aspects of this release of the Twitter files is how little it's being covered by the mainstream media. We're seeing a degree of silence on this that we haven't really seen since the days when Trump was in office. The media will tell you all about it when Elon Musk arranges for a couple of beds to be placed in Twitter HQ, but on this obviously genuinely public interest story, nothing. Musk has attained Trump-like status for the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN. They will cover negative stories, whatever they may be. Anything he does, at least with Twitter, that provides a degree of positive reinforcement just didn't happen. Or if it did happen, it's such a nothing burger that nobody would be interested in reading about it anyway. In the meantime, Musk has announced that Twitter is now working on a software update that will show your true account status, so you will know and you'll be able to appeal if you've been shadow banned. Which is a great lesson to all the others. By all means, seek to ensure that the virality of your platforms doesn't have impacts that would offend against your values. That's fine. But you should be transparent about what you're doing and why. And you should give people the right to appeal. That's all. Privately owned companies should be able to have the right to be politically biased if that's what they choose, but they have to openly declare it, not pretend to be neutral while secretly being the opposite. What we've uncovered is broadly what we thought was happening, but was being denied or fudged. Wasn't even happening because of settled intent within Twitter. It started one way and then bit by bit got used more and more widely, more and more edge cases by people too stuck in their own world perspective to notice where that was taking them. Exactly how systems so often go rotten. Now that's bad enough, and no doubt there's more to come with future revelations, which we await with interest. Meanwhile, in a country with zero transparency, we're seeing that pressure can still provoke change. Over the last couple of weeks, we've noted that growing pressure on this channel. Well, this week the pressure finally told, as China announced it was shifting gear away from its zero COVID policy. On Wednesday this week, it was announced that the strictest policies are to be relaxed. People with COVID can now isolate at home if they have mild or no symptoms. They no longer need to show test results to access most venues. They can travel more freely within the country. Lateral flow tests will replace PCR tests in most scenarios. Lockdowns, if they happen at all, will be at the building or even the floor of the building level, not the whole neighbourhood or cities. And following the deaths that triggered the recent protests, the new measures included a strict ban on blocking fire exits and doors or otherwise preventing health services from gaining access or residents from escaping a hazard. This relaxation coincides with the arrival of winter, when infections would be expected to be higher, and with the country's biggest wave of infections to date. All of which makes it clear that this is a shift from zero COVID to what we've attained in the rest of the world, living with COVID. And probably not on a timing that would have been the leadership's first choice. The main challenge will be how big the initial consequences of relaxation will be, given the extreme experience of Hong Kong in similar conditions last year, and indeed whether that relaxation survives some of those consequences. With that in mind, authorities are undertaking a renewed push to try to get elderly people to vaccinate. So, did the leadership make a mea culpa statement, noting that the previous policy was a mistake and maybe, apologising for the problems it caused? Well, of course not. The Chinese Vice Premier Sun Chunlan said that China was entering a new situation, thanks to the fact that the virus's ability to cause disease was weakening. Which is the conversation I was having on this very channel about this time last year, as I recall, as the UK government was pondering whether to cancel Christmas with yet another lockdown, and I was one of numerous people saying, what are you talking about? The data from South Africa shows that Omicron is less severe. And so it was, a year ago. But bear in mind, that's less severe in the face of a population where most genuinely vulnerable people, the elderly amongst others, have been vaccinated. The problem with Hong Kong was that wasn't the case, and so it is right now with China. So it's fingers crossed time. Chinese New Year is gradually approaching January, which is normally the point where large numbers of people move around the country. It will be the make or break moment, you would think. Does this mean that the protests will go away? Yes, for now. They largely had already, given the ability of the state to put police on the streets and to phone up the people who had been to protest and tell them not to do that again. But the policy change is testament to the fact the leadership realised they were on the edge of a precipice with this. So how far beneath the surface citizen discontent remains and how this plays out if there's a COVID surge, that all remains to be seen. And bear in mind the Chinese CCP won't necessarily be open about how big the surge actually is. Some social media users in China have started to attest to evidence of quite a major wave already. One quoted by the Associated Press speaking on Weibo said, "Half a company's people are out sick, but they still won't let us all stay home." Which is only what you'd expect, in line with the experience elsewhere. So we'll see. This is a new chapter. It's certainly not the end of the story. Here in the UK, we're too busy worrying about the weather to think too deeply about COVID. Cold weather has arrived in the UK, slightly ahead of schedule in fact, but following a milder than usual autumn. So now we get to see how the energy system is actually going to cope with an extended freezing spell. While that's been going on, There have been U-turns and outrage on energy policy to go round. So, on the one hand, a backbench rebellion pushed Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to U-turn on his policy to continue the ban on land-based wind turbines. Such turbines will now be permitted again, subject to evidence of support from the local community. That will probably lead to deals whereby those living close to new wind farms will get substantial discounts on their home energy bills in return for that support, which I imagine will mostly be forthcoming with that particular deal. That, plus the earlier rebanning of fracking, gained some grudging muttered appreciation from Green groups before they reverted back to their normal state of blinding fury by the announcement that the proposed Cumbrian coal mine is going to go ahead. If you recall, this is the mine which is intended to produce coking coal for the benefit of steel production and other key industry. 15% will be used in the UK, the rest will be exported. Now, as the government has been quick to point out, since all net zero plans have a medium-term requirement for fossil fuel power, albeit on a gradually reducing taper, this is really about where that fuel gets sourced, not about changing the commitment to net zero on the existing timescale. And one thing we've learned in recent months is that energy security is a real thing that can massively affect us, so there is a case to be made. However, the environmental campaigners and many of the others aligned to them are basically against whatever fossil fuel they see in front of their eyes. So if it's quietly imported, well, that's one thing. Barely a murmur has been produced with news that the UK has signed a deal for increased liquefied natural gas from the US for the coming period. But if it's produced locally, then that will be a source of incandescent rage. The truth in reality is this is much more of a symbolic discussion than anything, given the large numbers of coal-fired power stations continuing to be brought online in China and India, as well as other parts of Asia. And the early stage that the West is at when it comes to alternative sources for steel production, I mean, in principle, it could be moved over to green hydrogen, but right now we're starting almost from scratch with green hydrogen. So coking coal is going to be required for some considerable time yet. Meanwhile, more quietly, the UK has been investing in increased battery storage capacity. It's all very well putting up more wind turbines, but the key challenge is storing the energy when you have too much of it so that it can be used when the wind isn't blowing. Last winter, pre-Ukraine war, remember, that was a real problem as we experienced an extended period of cold weather alongside next to zero wind. And so we've seen in the last week or so as well, and this coming weekend. For much of the last week, the National Grid reported that fossil fuel had counted for as much as 60% of the UK's electricity generation compared to the more usual 40% at this time of year, because wind power was contributing only 7%. Now, there has been some movement. Battery storage capacity has been increased by 45% from 1.1 gigawatt to 1.6 gigawatts, with another 1.4 under construction. There's a significant 32 gigawatts of battery projects in the pipeline, which would then start to get to the sort of scale where it would play a major part. If the UK was to make net zero by 2050 as currently planned, the implied capacity for battery storage would then be around 50 gigawatts. Not much of that is going to be in play in the short term when it's most needed though, and this weekend is going to be a crunch point. There are times when you look at the news, you look at social media, and you conclude the entire world is broken. People are determined to have conversations in the most stupid way possible, and what's the point bothering? I mean, yes, I'm relentlessly positive and engaged on all the good things. Sometimes even I have those moments. Let me give you an example from this week. I saw an item that was being carried on the site, What's Up With That was being retweeted by high-profile names like Jordan Peterson and others that I follow, about Oxfordshire Council bringing in climate lockdowns. These pieces were, as usual, being shared with added outrage, zero suggestion that it was anything other than a wholly true and fair representation of an outrageous situation. Now, I took notice because even assuming the label climate lockdown was overblown, as these things always are, The essence of a story looked like something that I would be very keen to highlight as an example of stupid policy and overreach, which I do discuss here from time to time. But of course, I do not accept stories at face value. I check the detail to verify that they're accurate. I don't preach a point of view on this channel so much as I preach that process. And unfortunately, this story was just rubbish. No, this was a traffic control measure targeting routinely congested parts of a heavily congested city. Now, it might or might not be a good policy. Councils implement all sorts of wacky schemes in the names of controlling traffic, many of which have unintended consequences that come back to bite them and the people they're supposed to be serving. From what I've seen, this looks complicated, convoluted, usually the sign of a policy destined for failure. What it isn't is climate lockdown. The council has now been forced to issue a statement as a result of various people having read the nonsense, taken it at face value, and resorted to threatening council officers in the belief that they're all communists and eco-fascist. I looked at the original article. There was just one comment underneath from someone saying, "But my son lives in Oxford and I know about this one at first hand, and it's just about traffic management, not at all what you said here." All the rest of the comments took it at face value, layering on the outrage, utterly convinced once again that all the communist globalists are waiting to shut us in our homes. It does remind me of the fact that a couple of years ago, when the first lockdowns were imposed, I had commentators on here telling me to wake up. The phrase sheeple was probably used somewhere because it was obvious that lockdowns were all part of a plot and we were never going to be let out. Strangely enough, none of those people have said that they were wrong, as the whole world, save for China, were not only let out of lockdown, but increasingly started to reflect and realise that the original response may have been significant overreach. No, those people are still swearing that the WEF is still hovering on the edge of making its move, obvious to all who aren't too blind to see it. And you know what? In a couple of years' time, they'll still be hovering, and so on, until those people get bored or have something more interesting happen in their life to focus on instead. Now, that's not to say that growing autocratic tendencies in the real world is not a thing. In the traditional way, governments overreaching. We can have a grown-up conversation about that, but we can take comfort from China here, which is not a sentence I say often. China was, of course, the birthplace of the lockdown approach to dealing with the pandemic, the autocracy that exported its governing style to the rest of the world along with exporting COVID, and yet even there, as we've seen this week, even an authoritarian government with a massive infrastructure for censorship and citizen control, the recent protests and pushback have resulted in them giving way and ending the zero COVID policy that they've been clinging to. Even the true authoritarians, the best resourced such regime in the history of the world, still understands there comes a point beyond which they cannot push. For those who fear that authoritarianism is the secret agenda of every hapless politician they decide must be in on the scheme, this should be somewhat reassuring. Because yes, if Oxfordshire really did decide to go full on Marxist control of the population wouldn't stand for it. And they would quickly have to retreat because they would have no such mechanism to impose such a scheme against people's will, even if they could think of some reason why they would want it to be, which it's not really obvious what that would be. The principal lesson, as always, is that when you see something that makes you angry, that you find all too believable, maybe it's right, maybe you should be angry, but those are exactly the times when you should check the original sources. Because the reason why you find it all too believable might just be because you saw dozens of similar stories in the past that made you feel like, well, this sort of thing happens all the time, so it's only too believable. But if you take the time to look at those stories, you might have found they were all fake as well. So your gut instinct has now been distorted to believe in something that may not be true. All right. The plan this week had been to do a video on Monday or Tuesday about the Twitter Files story. But then it had been teased that a second tranche was coming, so I held off, and it didn't come, and I held off, and it didn't come, and I held off, and then finally it was said it was going to come earlier today, by which time it made sense simply to fold it into this episode. Lesson learned, Don't plan based on other people's timeline promises. There it is. My thanks to those who support this channel on Patreon. As always, you know the story. I could not spend the time making these videos without that support. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.